Right. So I'm feeling some kind of energy to talk about Christianity and my own exploration and just reflections and thoughts. I feel called to Jesus, called by, called to, called from, called towards, whatever preposition. I feel love there. I've always felt a strong pull in that direction. And so that's sort of the background, the backdrop to all this. I have to say, it's a real I've been going to church now, off and on, mostly on, for a few months, it seems. I don't know. It's hard to keep track of the timeline sometimes, but I've been trying out different things, going to different services, different places. When you live, yeah, well, I'm not going to get into that, but I also watch just a lot of Christian content. I just watch a lot of Christian content. I love it. Testimonies, podcasts, interviews. Various different videos. Mostly, I've been reading the Bible a lot. Just more and more, drawn in that direction. And there's a lot of stuff I don't like. I'll just start there, especially about the church going and just certain aspects of Christianity that I just really don't like, don't agree with, don't resonate, don't like. Maybe I should start the other direction. What I do like, Jesus is what I like. I'll just say that. I like Jesus. And he's such a universal, he's the universal figure. He is such a universal appeal, magnetism, attraction. At certain points, I've been just very in love with the Gospels. I remember reading them a few years back for the first time and just being just absolutely fascinated, loving it. There's a lot in there that I didn't know, and I love Christian history. I love just thinking about this one, seed. Lest the individual grain of wheat fall to the ground and die, cannot give birth to new fruit. Or I think it's in the Gospel of John. I looked it up recently. But Jesus as this, just absolutely, he rended fabric of time. The Western calendar that the majority of the world uses. I know there's other calendars, but essentially based around the pivot point of the fulcrum of history, Jesus Christ. 2 billion plus Christians in the world, and that's a statistic that needs to be unpacked because there's so many flavors of Christianity, and I haven't really looked into who all is counted in that, but you can pretty much assume that Jesus Christ is a big part of that 2 billion plus group currently on the planet, not to mention the billions who have been impacted. But yeah, just this apparition of God on earth, the apparition of Christ, apparition of something transcendent incarnating. Powerful, absolutely powerful, 2,000 years ago, and the reverberations of that, from this one, the individual grain of wheat, and just this tidal wave of transformation that's engulfed the planet. It speaks so deeply to one's humanity. Such a human story in so many ways. It holds a mirror up to the wickedness, and a story that just so resonates across the ages. Completely different part of the world, completely different part of history, completely different, culture, etc., etc., and yet just so deeply felt to this day. Embodies so much of the human experience and points to the reality of the divine life, points to the reality of supernatural, points to the reality of something much bigger going on here. But Christ is the Son. He's S-O-N-S and S-U-N. He's that emanation. He's that effulgent spirit. He's that guiding light, that pole star. And I think society, at this stage of the game, I think society does run better with a strong Christian operating system. I think it's foolish to think that you can just I'm not as knowledgeable about this as I could be, but I also am not a complete fool. In some ways I am, but in terms of just general knowledge about Western civilization, and I know that Greco-Roman influence is major in terms of certain aspects of our political organizing and just kind of the some of the more foundational structures and of civilization. I don't question how big of an impact that Greco-Roman influence has been. But the Judeo-Christian influence, and I wouldn't be able to disentangle all this. I don't have that level of information and wisdom and knowledge and intelligence. I don't have that level of understanding, let's say, of study to disentangle where one thing ends, where the other begins. But I think it's be true to say, it's reasonable to say, at a minimum, that the impact has been profound in terms of morality, in terms of ethics, in terms of, and how those inform legal structures, and how those legal structures inform the foundational documents of a civilization, and the foundational, all the way up to, the formalization of state structures of governance, but certainly, in individual lives as well, Can anybody doubt that Jesus Christ has powerfully transformed the world, and what he set in motion, the light that he brought forward, how profound of an impact that has had? And here's where there's a big discussion on the framers, the founding fathers, and deism, and what exactly people believe. Thomas Jefferson's Bible, cutting out certain... But it is the major spiritual influence, underpinning structure context of Western civilization, which, has extended out beyond just, of course, beyond Europe, of course, beyond what becomes the United States, obviously all of the Americas, huge Roman Catholic influence throughout most of, the Western Hemisphere. Obviously Protestant, evangelical in the States, Canada, and increasingly in Latin America, from what I understand. But you look at Africa, and I don't have all the numbers, but I know there's huge Christian populations, Africa, Asia, growing in Asia. And there's something to be said, and I'm not going to articulate it well. Not that I'm articulating any of this well, but this is just kind of a scattershot ideas that are coming to mind. There's something to be said about the native or indigenous or traditional spirituality, traditional spiritual practice of a culture, and how that coheres a given group of people, a given society. And I don't know that this scales, that's kind of an anthropological observation that, when you cut off a group from its own spiritual roots, they become, nihilism quickly enters into the picture, they become adrift. And I think that's a pretty basic fact, a pretty basic statement, that would be observable definitely on a smaller scale, in indigenous societies, something like that. And I see something like that. Of course, the scales almost make it an absurd comparison. They do make it kind of an absurd comparison between an indigenous small tribal group and something, a behemoth, a megalith, a mega structure, a megalopolis, mega civilization like the U.S. But I think the thing that coheres any group of people has something to do. In other words, it doesn't come from an external. It comes from a subtler level. It comes from a deeper foundational connection to the transcendent, to God. And from there, that's like the headwaters, and from there the river can flow, in an orderly way. It's like you got to get that foundational piece right, that connection to the transcendent, to the divine, for everything to fall into place downstream. You can't reverse engineer it. Which, in a sense, that's the communist project, the socialist project, the political project, because those are upstream from, those identities are subsidiary, is that the word? They are lesser identities, they are downstream identities, they are partial identities, they are relative identities within the larger context of one's foundational being in God. God as universal being, as universal intelligence. And so if you're cut off from that and you're identifying anywhere else, you're setting up shop anywhere else, you're asking your politics, your political identity, your gender identity, your racial identity, your occupational identity, if you're asking any of those to contain the fullness of your being as a human being, as a child of God on the planet, it just doesn't work. It's bound to distort and ultimately lead to death, sickness, illness, death. So there has to be that connection to, the transcendent, and religion, imperfect as it is the vehicle for that for so many. And at scale, it's religion that does that. Not that you can't be connected to God, to Jesus, to whatever, as an individual, But when we're talking about building a civilization, having something, a project like a democracy or a nation or something, being able to sustain itself and to flourish, it has to be built from the ground up, having some kind of a foundational identity in God, in the transcendent. Without that, there will always be a need for a God, for something to worship. And that's where idolatry, in a biblical context comes in. When you've gotten rid of true God, true transcendence, true divinity, then you raise up all kinds of idols and you put them on pedestals. And in a more down-to-earth way, that's our addictions, that we worship our addictions, that we worship our kind of bespoke custom identity, small self identities here on this planet, and we raise the individual, the self, the ego, into that place that is only God can truly sustain and fulfill. And so all of that is to say that as a country, there needs to be a strong spiritual foundation as a civilization. And that is Christianity in the U.S. Not that there aren't other religions, not that they can't, you don't have freedom. I mean, that's part of the Bill of Rights. You have the freedom to assemble, freedom to worship, freedom of religion, freedom from religion, as some people have said it. But because Christianity is so interwoven, so baked into the history, to the values, to all the different, the legal structure, ethical structure, political structure, historical realities of the country, the more you get away from that, the more you dismantle that, the more you spurn that. I can't think of a good word right now. Turn from that. The more unstable the society will become, and that's just obvious. We're in such a free fall, such a decline, such a entropy, in this country. And I see that now as an older adult, as an older person. Not that I'm old, but older. That at the large scale, you need that kind of coherence, you need that social narrative, you need that foundational spirituality. And in a way, it kind of protects and preserves the peripheral, having that strong, robust cultural, you could even say monoculture, that's probably not quite the word I want to use, but cultural identity, healthy, robust. There's such a largesse there, there's such a bigness there, there's such a stability, such a coherence there, that it allows for things on the periphery to exist, It allows for a certain generativity, a certain creativity. What we've done in the recent age is try to invert that and bring everything on the periphery and put that in the center. But you're destroying the foundation, creating this huge vacuum, and then just throwing all this chaos into it. It's just a recipe for madness, destruction, chaos, brutality, and so yeah, that's how I see it. I see it that way. Now, you could ask, well, okay, so let's say that's true for the U.S. What about Saudi Arabia? What about Yemen? What about Indonesia? What about Iraq, Pakistan? Would the same apply in those regions? Using everything you've said, but just inputting Islam as the operating system? Or, on a smaller scale, indigenous societies, animistic beliefs, shamanistic beliefs. etc. And I think it does basically apply that way. That you have to have a spiritual identity in something transcendent. Something deeper than any individual self, also deeper than, I would argue, deeper than the mind, which is a lot of the issue here. See, there's a lot to say in this area. But yeah, I would basically say that's true. I mean, I haven't done as deep of a dive on this to really speak strongly. This is just one man's observation, one person's observations on how things are. Now, that doesn't mean that India, Hindu beliefs, and Hinduism's kind of a different beast. No, that's not quite the right word, but a different case, because it's such a diverse collection of beliefs that we kind of put. I mean, there are some kind of overarching things. Vishnu, Brahman, Shiva, preserver, creator, destroyer. That kind of unite Hindu beliefs, but it's a cornucopia. I mean, there's a lot of different things that fall under that term Hinduism. But when you try to uproot the connection to the divine, and at scale, again, that tends to be the religion of a given society, chaos ensues. It's just so clear to me. I think the thing to do is to strengthen it, and that's not without shadows, major shadow sides. That's not without dangers, and it's very fraught territory, and that's not a straightforward process, even though I see it in a pretty straightforward way, just for the sake of being direct and clear. Like, you need to have a strong cultural identity. I was going to say, that's not to say that all religions are equal, or that all belief structures are equal, or that I, see all of them as good and equal. No, having surveyed, having traveled, having, lived a little bit of a life here, it seems that the operating system that flows out of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that flows out of Acts and the epistles, conduces by and large at scale, to a better society, one that has more respect for the individual, a better balance between the individual and the group, that tends to associate with more traditional, classical, liberal values like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, basically Bill of Rights type of stuff. I say that recognizing my ignorance, in the sense that I haven't read the Quran. I've given little attempts at it. I've definitely heard a lot about it, studied it somewhat, even in formal environments. Spent some time in the Muslim world. Not a lot of time, but some time. And again, you could say that's cultural chauvinism. That is the kind of thing that one would expect somebody having been born in America to say. And I guess that, But Christ preached nonviolence. I mean, he died forgiving people on the cross. He wasn't a warlord. He wasn't, he's the Prince of Peace. Not to say that he was weak no, he was stunningly brave, stunningly courageous, stunningly strong. it makes me emotional thinking about the example that he set forward. But anyways, so at scale, Christianity, I think, just tends to produce a better society. I'll just say it that way. And there's a way in which having a strong Christian society, again, having a strong central cultural identity, spiritual identity, tends to protect and preserve in some kind of way that I haven't totally fleshed out the periphery. It's no coincidence that the Bill of Rights arises in a Judeo-Christian society that protects, people's freedom of choice, freedom to choose evil, freedom to choose the wrong thing. That freedom and liberty is so foundational in the pursuit of what's good and what's true. You have to have the freedom to experiment and to make mistakes and to challenge and to try out new ideas. Anyways, so I love that about Christian heritage. Now, and I love, even in the particulars, I find Christianity very beautiful. Going to church, I went to an Orthodox, I think Russian or Greek, I think it was a Russian Orthodox church. Stunningly beautiful church and service. And the people there were all quite beautiful. There's like an aesthetic purity of like, wow, did I just walk into a waiting room for heaven, or perhaps even an entry room into heaven? Just so beautiful. And the liturgy, I love liturgy, love ritual. Love the images, absolutely love the icons. Oof, love them. Love seeing the icons and the care and thought and artistry and love and passion, tradition, depicting Christ and depicting, the heavenly host, depicting community of saints, people that have dedicated their lives to Jesus Christ in humility and goodness and peace and love. And the Gospels, integrity, etc. Love it. Absolutely love it. Love it, love it. And similar feelings, Catholic churches. I've been to all kinds of different cathedrals and Catholic churches, and love the history, love the tradition, love the wide universality of Catholicism. Amazing how long it's been intact. St. Francis, so many of the saints, just absolutely beautiful, wonderful. And praying the rosary. Again, just the ritual, the liturgy, formality of it, something so beautiful about the whole thing. Reassuring, comforting. Now, evangelical churches, I grew up Lutheran, so Protestant for sure. I mean, that's ground zero Protestantism. And it was, now that I have a broader sense of the Christian denominational experience, sort of a middle ground church, because I haven't been to tons of Lutheran churches, but the one I grew up in, reverence for communion, love communion. I've been to a number of Protestant evangelical churches recently with like minimal communion, if any communion, some with just zero communion. I can't understand that. That just doesn't feel like church to me, I'll be honest. But I was catechized, I was confirmed when I was young, got baptized at an age when I was old enough to remember. Maybe it was a second baptism, I don't know, but definitely at least once. Pastor was a good person, lots of good experiences. I went to youth group and played music, I think, in the church band, at least once or twice, I don't know, played the guitar when I was younger. And took communion, love communion, loved it then. Can remember really enjoying it, especially now. I think it's just such an important part of a Christian community is communion. Hate, really dislike that Catholics, I mean, I can respect and understand that the church wants you to be a committed member pursuing their vision of Christ, pursuing Catholicism, and that you have to be, I guess, catechized or confirmed or go through a process before you're eligible to take communion in the Catholic Church. But man, I really don't like that. I really dislike that. I can understand it on the one hand, and in a sense, it speaks to the confidence and strength of the church that it's willing to have, certain boundaries and certain rules, etc. I'm not against the rules in that sense. Antinomian, is that the word? I don't know. But man, there's so many times where I've been in a Catholic church totally feeling the Spirit, feeling so connected, and then it just feels brutal to not be able to go up and take communion. So anyways, the church I grew up in, it was communion-based. That was a part of the service every Sunday, and not wafers. Actual bread. Pastor would bring out like this, just full loaf of, baked bread. Always tasty too. And actual wine, or you could do grape juice too, and we'd stand in a circle and just awesome, absolutely awesome. That's such a poignant, potent, powerful part of the Gospels, the Last Supper. Yeah, and the church I grew up in, the pastor had his religious attire. I don't know the actual name. I don't think it was a frock, scapular. I don't know what the actual, but kind of a white garment, a long flowing open garment, and a sash, like a green sash. I think there are probably other colors too, but so there was a formality to it, and there was a structure, and there was a ritual. And that's great. I just so appreciate that. And I love the seasonal reality of Christianity that you have, Easter, Christmas, Lent, that you have, time is marked out by the Christian walk with certain, spiritual landmarks as you go throughout the calendar year. That's fantastic. Love that. And everybody feels the magic of Christmas, and that's Christ. That magic of his transcendent, ineffable grace flooding the earth, the darkest time of year. Just that hope, that light, that beacon, that eminence, that peace, that grace. Love a lot of Christian music. So yeah, please. There's a lot that I really, really deeply love and value about Christianity. Yeah, and again, it's universal. I'll just say that. It's got such a universal appeal. It's not just a Western phenomenon. People all across the world for centuries, millennia, have felt what's true and powerful and transformative about Jesus and his life and his message. And even as I've gotten older, and especially the past years, as I've had just a lot of spiritual experience, the more sort of supernatural claims of Christianity and the Bible, what once may have seemed far out, at best mythical or archetypical in the Gospels, now seems to me kind of run-of-the-mill. That's not quite the right word, but if anything, sort of an understatement of how complex the totality of creation is, in terms of demonic influence, in terms of angelic support, in terms of other realms, in terms of the supernatural that's just beyond question for me, just because of so much personal experience, direct experience. So that part of the equation is not a hang up for me at all. If anything, it's a validation of what I've discovered myself, and tends to speak to me of the legitimacy or the reality of what Christ and what the Bible is pointing to, especially in the Gospels, but all throughout the Bible. Now, and I'm just going to be honest. I'm trying to be honest all the way around as I'm working all this out in my mind. There are issues that I have. I'm trying to think if there's more I want to say in the positive direction here. Yeah, I mean, even something like the resurrection. I mean, the Shroud of Turin. Yeah, I mean, will we ever know definitively? There's just so much about it that just seems like more and more just like a cascade, an avalanche of evidence pointing in the direction of its authenticity. And I did another video where I sort of speculated on the sort of subtler dynamics of how something like that could have happened, and using the case of Tibetan light body, the rainbow light body, and how once you step outside of the scientific materialist paradigm into a spirit only, a consciousness only model, so much becomes available and possible, and it makes so much sense out of spiritual experience and opens up so many avenues, such that something like the resurrection and Jesus's transcendence in that sense doesn't seem impossible to me at all. Shroud seems to speak powerfully to it. I have to say, I don't know, what actually happened back then. 2,000 some years ago. Almost exactly 2,000 years ago. That Christ was killed. Whoa, that's crazy. So if he was killed in AD 30 or AD 31, something like that 2,000 year mark is fast approaching. So, but that he would be a miracle worker, that transcendent grace, that distortions of what we consider the time-space fabric and normal physics and physical laws, bending, etc. That's not out of the question at all for me. Not at all. Not even close. I don't know, because I wasn't there. But I have strong intuitions on it, and a sense of the possibility for sure, just based on things I've experienced in my own direct insight into the nature of reality. And personal experiences with Jesus, and so many testimonies. I mean, it's just like, from near-death experiences to just these powerful, from drug addict to Jesus Christ testimony videos, from Satanist to Jesus Christ testimony, from New Age to from yoga to Jesus, from prison to Jesus, from just from Muslim to Jesus, from shaman to Jesus, just on and on and on. And just the powerful transformations in people's lives, and the clarity and the luminosity, and my own personal experiences. And it'd be hard to, I'm trying my best to get out a sense, kind of an impressionistic sense, but there's more than I could really easily fit into words. But again, just the simplest way to say it is I find Jesus endlessly appealing, and you would expect that, the incarnation of God, the incarnation of truth, that because it's coming from upstream, from the foundational level, everything downstream is going to be coherent. His life, his message, the teachings, the energy, everything that flows forth from that bears that foundational coherence. So it's going to work at a historical level. It's going to work at a mythical level. It's going to work at an archetypical level. It's going to work at at whatever level of consciousness somebody engages with it, it bears that coherence and it opens up into greater depth the more you go into it, because it's coming from that depth. So following into that opening, I am the gateway, I am the door, I am the light, will lead you back into that foundational beingness, that foundational effulgence of God. So of course it works just on so many levels, and you see that universality in so many other religions, that Christ is a figure of transcendent meaning, in Islam, of course, with very important theological differences, historical explanations, etc. But he's a prominent figure. It's not like he's unheard of within Islam. And that's the other major world religion. I think they're 2 billion or close to 2 billion. That's more than that. Half the planet's population has some, if not very direct and central authority and connection and love for and meaning associated with Jesus, being the Christian side of the 4 billion people. Within just that set of 4 billion people, Christians and Muslims, Jesus plays a major role because he is so pivotal. Because I see him as, the Son of God, as the Creator himself, as love itself, as truth itself, as justice, mercy, strength, peace, power itself, walking on earth. But of course, I've spent so much time exploring the circuit of spirituality and religion. Just about every New Ager loves Jesus. And has deep feelings about him, from Course in Miracles to the Law of One to, whatever, Christ reigns. He's supreme. Now, not supreme in quite the way the Christians describe it, and of course there's very important differences there, but very central and powerful beloved figure. Hinduism, absolute love and zero problem in so many ways with accepting Jesus. Now, in that context, Jesus is an avatar. Jesus is a great master, spiritual master, an avatar. Within the Hindu context, meaning he's an incarnation of God, which is the Christian message. 100%, that is the Christian message. However, Christ is not the only avatar in Hinduism. And in fact, there are many walking the earth to this day, contemporary with our moment, who are considered to be avatars. Amaji, Mother Meera, Meher Baba, who passed, within the last 50 years or something like that. Neem Karoli Baba. And so within that context, there's like this sense of Brahman or God, eternal, timeless, creative divinity, creative light, creative being, out of which there are these rays, these emanations, these incarnations of God, Krishna being one, all the panoply, is that the right word? In this sense, you could say that the pantheistic array of Hinduism, of all the different gods, being different incarnations of Brahman. That may not be perfectly correct, but it's close enough. But that's where Jesus gets slotted in. They already had kind of a cultural language and a cultural framework and concept for somebody like a Jesus. But yeah, he's beloved in Hinduism. That's the point I'm trying to make. Just about every corner of the world, Christian or not Christian, there is a love for Jesus, recognition of Jesus Christ. Yes, there are detractors. Yes, there are people who outright are hostile to Jesus, which is wild. But by and large, he's just... So... And here's all this kind of lays some of the groundwork, or at least opens up some avenues here to talk about some of the disagreements I have and things that I'm working through myself about Christianity. the exclusivity of Jesus Christ being the only way. I have to say that more than anything is daunting, and I don't know that I fully align with that. I can understand theologically, ideologically, historically, why a claim like that gets made. And it's not surprising that a religion would stake out exclusive ground and have certain exclusivity claims. I think many religions do that. And within Christianity, many denominations take up that mantle, claiming that their Christianity is the one true Christianity. So part of me just wants to say that's just human psychological development individually and collectively, that's a reflection of that kind of tribalistic tendency within the human consciousness, human psyche. Because truth is truth, right? It's either true or it's not true, and it's not Catholic. There's not Catholic truth, Anglican truth, Tibetan Buddhist truth, Advaita Vedantic truth, shamanistic truth. If it's true, and it's capital T truth, that means it's universal. It's not contingent. It's absolute. It's not relative. It's not contextual. It's just true. It's transcendentally true, not dependent upon conditions, time, period, culture. It's transcendently true. And there's a number of just kind of grotesque things that flow out of that kind of a claim that Christ is the one and only way, the only begotten Son of God. And I'm not saying that that's not true. I'm wrestling with it and saying it's something that gives me a great deal of concern, and just doesn't feel I have to be honest, doesn't feel true. I mean, maybe in certain moods and certain moments, and doesn't always feel true. Anyways, but it gives rise to all kinds of kind of grotesque conclusions, best summed up in kind of a pithy, dramatic example or framing, something like, so is Mahatma Gandhi in hell? I've had that thought, and I'm not alone in having it. Is the Dalai Lama going to hell? Thich Nhat Hanh, Yogananda. In other words, these people who deeply realized, have deep connection to the divine, have lived saintly lives, have lived very Christ-like lives, and most of the ones that I mentioned have a certain love for Christ. Yogananda definitely, Gandhi definitely, big fan of Jesus, the Beatitudes. Inspired a lot of his nonviolent work, I believe, along with Leo Tolstoy. And of course, other nonviolent strains within Hinduism. But I know the Dalai Lama has a love of Jesus. I've seen him say as much, a reverence for. But because they, as far as I know, have not confessed in the very kind of narrow Christian context, Jesus Christ is the one and only Lord and Savior, one and only gateway to heaven. So they're in eternal damnation. Now, there are priests and preachers that I like and listen to and really enjoy and I have a strong affinity for, that I've heard answer versions of this question, and often they kind of sidestep it and say, I'm not God. Who am I to judge? I don't know who's in heaven and hell. And theologically, I guess that's appropriate, but I don't think it's the very honest, especially a lot of these guys are so honest and direct with what they feel, but they always seem to kind of default into sort of a political answer, it seems to me, or in other words, I think the more honest answer would be to say, that it's at least not a hard conclusion to come to or to speculate about, given the Christianity's exclusivity claims that Gandhi is in hell. I don't think that's a big leap from a lot of mainline Christianity and what they believe to make a statement like that. And him being, a powerful example of it, just because, the life he lived. But then we generalize out across, billions of people currently living and across time who, and let's just assume the ones that I'm talking about at least have heard about the gospel, have heard about Jesus Christ, have heard about the exclusivity claims, and who have nonetheless not been Christian, and who have lived as Buddhists, lived as Hindus, lived as Muslims, died as Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, and whatever other background, but lived as decent people, loved God, had a connection to something transcendent. So within again, just very kind of mainline Christian worldview, one would have to say that they did not enter into glory. If we're being honest, leaving aside opinions on that or values, just that is what most Christians would say if they were being honest and coherent with the belief system, their beliefs. Boy, that's a bitter pill. And I just don't know that that's right. I just don't know that that's right. And I can personalize it even more, something even more important than somebody like a Gandhi to me, in some ways, personally more important, is I've had teachers, one in particular that I've spoken about, who I guess he's Catholic. I've tried to kind of have a conversation with him about this, and he doesn't seem to want to have it too much, but I mean, describes himself as Catholic, goes to Mass, and I guess was catechized, I'm assuming, baptized in the Catholic Church growing up or something. But I mean, he's big into so many things that no earnest, sincere, mainline, things that the Pope would say, no, this is not in communion with what we believe as Catholics, This is the teacher I'm talking about, big proponent of, experiencer of Kundalini awakening, and has helped probably thousands of people at this point who have experienced Kundalini awakening. If there's an expert on the planet, this guy is one of them at least. And just psychologically, he's a remarkable person. He's a remarkable individual, and his story, he found his teacher when he was young. He was a student also of Adyashanti for a long time, and he's the real deal, But again, yeah, he works with and advocates that Kundalini is a true and good thing, a gift from God. He works with, he's a big lover of somebody like Amaji, the Hindu hugging saint, and he's got a very broad spirituality, is one way to put it, eclectic spirituality. He's spent time in the Tibetan tradition, and he's a meditator, and had major awakenings, head, heart, and gut within a certain system, talks about chakras and has big experiences with beings on other levels, communicates with the dead. All these things that are just major red flags for Christianity. He doesn't see a problem with it. For a long time, I haven't, and I'm still not sure where I stand on some of this stuff. But when I've tried to raise some of these concerns to him, he just... Anyways, but all the fruits of the Spirit are there with this guy. Hugely generous, hugely loving, very strong individual. He's got a family man. He's very grounded. Big heart. Radiant person. Has been through a lot of brutal stuff, and has wisdom, patience, wisdom, grace, strength, love. I've got little things that bother me about him, but person who cares about ethics, who has integrity, definitely a huge lover of Jesus. But somebody for whom Jesus would be, I think, probably one of the most important figures in his life, if not the central one. But certainly he wouldn't hold that Jesus was the one and only Son of God, despite him saying he's Catholic. And see, there's a gauntlet that gets thrown down in Christianity that you can't hold on to all those other practices. He's somebody that consults with astrologers and, a lot of things that are kind of new agey. But I've just had so many experiences with him that are true experiences, real experiences, and he's the real deal. And so I'm not totally fleshing it out as well as I could, but what I'm trying to get at is I would have to basically think that this man, because, let me just make the statement. I would have to basically think that he is deceived. Who is the deceiver in a Christian context? That's Satan. Demonic influence. But I'll be honest, I'm getting a call here. I'll be honest, compared to, especially on my sojourns into churches, talking with pastors, talking with people, the vastness of this teacher's heart, this teacher's consciousness, this teacher's strength, experience, I brought to him just so many confusing, chaotic, crazy things, and he's been able to be a light, a clarifying light for me and for hundreds of other people. In a non-dogmatic way, in an authentic way, in an aligned way, in a true way, in a loving way. And I hold that example up against so many of the preachers and stuff who I've met some good people for sure, but it's hard to put this into words, but it's something like talking to because there's a bigger point I want to make in here about conceptual understanding, creedal understanding, dogmatic affirmation versus living experiential reality. And I'm trying to figure a way into that conversation, but this teacher, compared to, most of the Christians I've met, and again, people in a position of authority who have studied, who have, a certain kind of blessing or a position to be a leader, to be a light within the Christian church, it's just night and day. How much insight, how much wisdom, how much power, how much love, how much grace, how much truth I feel, how much resonance I feel with this one teacher. Bigness of spirit, living experiential truth compared to, it just doesn't really compare, when I think about a lot of the preachers, even the really, good ones. It's a little bit like, this is what I'm trying not to say, so hold this lightly because I just haven't found the right way to say it, but it's something like kindergarten versus an advanced college course or something like that, where this teacher I feel is just so integrated and balanced and whole and human and bright and present and open and clear and, in a sense, vacant, vacant to God shining through. Holy, the holiness that I experience, that living reality, transcendence, the holiness, is something like a graduate level or doctoral level. And when I go into the presence of these churches and stuff, it's maybe, I don't know, elementary school. Please forgive me, because it's such a judgmental, it can be heard very judgmentally, and I'm sure there's a better way to state that, but just the level of development of holiness operating in an unself-conscious way, in a living way, an experiential way, is just so stark, the difference. Now, would that have been present, that level of holiness, been present in front of Jesus Christ? Yes, and I imagine infinitely more so. As powerful as this teacher is and authentic as this teacher is I'm describing, I just have the sense, Christ is that on steroids, to an infinite degree, Would that have been present in a St. Francis? Yes, I imagine it would be. Is that present in the presence of certain Christian holy men who have kind of gone beyond or transcended the form of the religion into the formless reality of God? I think so. I think it's absolutely possible that it shines through a vehicle like Christianity. But nothing that I've said in the last 5 minutes, whatever, would be coherent, or if coherent, just barely coherent. It'd be like a foreign language in a lot of the churches I've been into. And it's because there's such an emphasis on belief and concept. And see, this is another great issue I have with Christianity, is the sort of reliance on creedal affirmations, on dogma, on concepts, and belief, which is essentially a mental affirmation. You are engaging at a conceptual level when that you're saying, whatever, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, or whatever dogma of the church. And I don't say dogma with any kind of, I don't mean that in a divisive or a derogatory sense, just in a technical, liturgical, ecclesiastical sense. The dogmas of the church, the beliefs, the foundational beliefs. And that's because who you are, who we are, who all of us are, essentially is much deeper than concepts. Our being is untainted by those concepts. Concepts exist within the space of our being. They are subset, subsidiary, subject to, smaller than, contained within a larger context, a meta context, more foundational context, which is our being, the vastness of our being. And that's not theory, that's not concept, that's direct experience. And you can have that direct insight just through direct observation. What exactly is a thought? What is a concept? What are these words? What is sensation in direct experience if you touch it experientially, not through a conceptual framework, not through the mind, but directly in experience? What is sight? What is hearing? What is taste? What is touch? And for that level of insight, Christianity in so many ways, especially, I'm just going to say especially kind of evangelical Christianity, that contemplative dimension, that mystical dimension, that insight level dimension into the nature of reality is just anathema, or just so outside of the frame, so outside of the frame that it just wouldn't compute. It doesn't make sense, and yet these are real things. And that's kind of the gift of, as I see it currently, Eastern spiritual practice. Yes, there are streams of it in contemplative Christianity, especially some of the older traditions. But modern evangelicalism, especially, is a very, it's word-based, sola scriptura. If I'm getting that right, I should be a little bit less cavalier throwing all this stuff around, because I haven't studied some of what I'm saying in depth, but there's a huge emphasis on the Bible. Love the Bible. Tons of truth in there, tons of gems in there. Inspired Word of God, sure, why not, It's the only book I own currently, I'll just say that. Not that I think it's the only worthwhile book, but but because there's such an emphasis on written word, it produces a certain kind of belief structure and a certain kind of practice and a certain kind of Christian and a certain kind of Christianity that's based on creedal affirmations. I believe in God the Father Almighty, and in His only Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who was crucified, or who was persecuted, born of the Virgin Mary, persecuted under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, descended into hell. The third day He rose again, or whatever, I don't have it all perfectly memorized. There's actually a lot in those creeds that I actually pretty much agree with and love, and part of me really loves the ritual of it and having those kind of, you got to belong somewhere. Yes, God is universal, but we're particular. We have these particular incarnations that we're in, and so it's not bad that somebody would have a Christian identity. No, that's part of your humanity. That's part of what you're doing here on earth. That's, you are a particular. You are particular, and so that's gonna show up in 1,000 different ways in how you live your life. But it's like they want truth to be contained in a concept or contained in an affirmation or contained, and there's such an emphasis on, you got to say this prayer, you have to believe this specific thing. And my experience is that God is contacted at a level much deeper than belief. Now, are there levels to this? And maybe that's the appropriate level for somebody at a certain level of consciousness, that making those affirmations and joining a church and doing that walk can really help to stabilize their life, get them out of, sin, out of addiction, out of chaos, out of instability. And so it's really important to have that identity. And so it's an affirmation of God moving in that right direction. Yes, that's a good possibility, that there's levels to this, and church is one level. That is a possibility. I've considered that. Again, and that goes to this idea that Jesus is coherent at every level of development, right? And so maybe church is a certain level of development, evangelical, Protestant Christianity is a certain level of development that, if engaged with in an authentic way, in a deep way, can potentially open you up into deeper experience. I think it's a great risk, though, if that's true, I'm just exploring right now, I'm not saying I absolutely believe any of this. This is just kind of an exploration out loud. But there's a great risk, if that is true in the way I framed it, of getting trapped in the concepts, getting trapped in the thought, and becoming very tribal, where differences in doctrine are equivalent to banishment from heaven. And there seems to be a certain kind of idolatry in there that I'm trying to wrestle with or articulate. An idolatry of theology, an idolatry of ideas. I'm also aware of certain, is it St. Augustine? Or Thomas Aquinas? Si comprenderes non est Deo. Maybe that's not quite right, but if you understand it, that's not God. Meaning, God, it can't be contained in a concept. Human understanding is too small, too partial, to grapple with. God is about as close as you can get. That God is, I am that I am. God is beingness itself. And I've heard, for example, Bishop Barron, Catholic bishop, recognize that and talk that language. And I was surprised to hear that and very affirmed to hear him say something like that God is beingness itself. And so I'm leery about in-group, out-group dynamics and the ways that when you build a worship, when you build a community on a narrow set of concepts on belief, that it basically just sets up a kind of in-group, out-group dynamic. Now that in and of itself, I can also say is not the end of the world, because we're particular beings and we need to have certain containers in this life, in order to function. But it can get unhealthy really quickly. And I gotta say, there's ways in which I'm really leery about the kind of intertwining of Christianity in the US and politics. Not that Christianity and the Gospels don't lend themselves to a certain political reading, but our civilization is so saturated with political content and commentary, and it's such a fascination. It's like the national sport in some ways, obsession with the news and with politics, and that it has become sort of perhaps in the shadow of a post-Christian society. That sounds too academic, but in the shadow of Christianity, crumbling and becoming less relevant, being deconstructed, and people turning from Christianity and from God, politics kind of fills that vacuum for a lot of people, and their identity becomes so and politics is so dirty, it's so corrupt and so dirty. And so I'm just leery, a lot of the event, one in particular I went to, but when it's just so explicitly, and Christian nationalism, and when it's so explicitly, it's like, what are we doing here at church? Is this just another arm of of a political party? I thought we were here to worship God. You know what I mean? I thought we were here to talk about Christ and his life and his teachings. And I don't know, it's hard to really draw a stark line here, because again, you want your Christianity and your spirituality and your connection with God to inform your movement in the world. And so, of course, that has political implications. But there's just a kind of certitude, smugness, arrogance, I think certitude, that just feels wrong sometimes, that we're in possession of the truth. And so this is what it means politically. This has to be politically. Now, I say that, and a part of me agrees with a lot of, and even in the beginning of this video, I talked about how, having a Christian operating system for society and for families and for individuals seems to create a more coherent society than other operating systems, and especially in the context of a traditionally Christian society. Not having Christianity creates just chaos. So I haven't worked all this out, but there's something that just, I guess, frightens me about all of that. I don't know. It feels good to say Christ is Lord. I remember when I first started, I had this big experience of Jesus. I tried to explain a little bit in another video. And not too long after that, I was living in the Pacific Northwest. remember going in Oregon. I remember going into this little Catholic shop downtown. I wanted to get a rosary. I wanted to start praying the rosary. And I was going through a hard time, but I remember I went into this store, and something I never had done or probably would have done, a year before that, just walking into that store, or at least not with the mindset I had, but just loved being in there. And I remember the thing that I loved so much, that meant so much to me. I'm feeling some emotion coming up, but and it's just such a small thing, but I remember saying and thinking about, wow, I get to say God bless or God bless you to this lady, the woman at the register. And it just felt so good for the first time in a long time, maybe ever, that I really remember. Just sincerely being able to say, God bless you, and meaning it, It wasn't perfunctory, it wasn't just a social ritual, social nicety. Because it's clear to me God exists, that there's a transcendent realm. Supernatural is real, that I love Jesus. That there is a kind of cosmic intelligence. Man, it just felt so good to say that. God bless you. And I'm sure it meant, nothing to her, I'm sure. Well, I'm sure it was a nice thing, but I'm sure she hears that all day. But for me, it was a really kind of special moment. So yeah, those are some thoughts I have. Now, hell is real. That's another thing that I think Christianity gets right. I've experienced it, and not just in a metaphorical way, that we talk about life being dark and broken here on this planet, and that is a form of hell also. But I've been there, and that's the subject maybe for another video. Hell is absolutely real. And horrific. More horrific than you can't really speak anything that even touches the horror of it. And so I'm praying, I'm praying that the truth would continue to be revealed to me. And my commitment is just to try to be honest about it, where I'm at. And I'll tell you, trying to hold on to all these different Christian beliefs. The other reason why this matters to me is because I've been struggling supernaturally with spiritual attack for so many years now. Actual, we could say demonic, dark attacks, physical violations. I've been in contact with hell. I've been to hell, I'll just say it. And with demons, and these are real things. It doesn't really make sense when you've had a lot of these experiences to talk about them in terms of archetype, in terms of them being, aspects of one's psyche. That almost, first it comes off as kind of ignorant. I'll just be honest. Having dealt with it, having experienced it, it comes off as theoretical or conceptual, high-minded, or, but also sort of grotesque, because these experiences can be very brutal, and the violations that you have of your soul, of your spirit, can be very awful, and you don't want to invalidate those experiences. And I've been subject to a lot of it. I have a lot of familiarity with that area, unfortunately. And so I've had to learn different ways of dealing with it. And it's a whole bigger story, and I'm not going to get into the whole story now. I'm just going to speak some pretty far out things, just say it how it is, you know. It's not really far out when you're living it. I mean, it is and it isn't, but demons exist, you know, dark beings exist, and they're psychopaths, they're sociopaths, they're psychopaths, they're demented, you know. If ethics and morality point us in the direction of the goodness, wishing goodness upon others and delighting in other people's joy and other people's goodness, these beings operate under the inversion of that they actively seek to immiserate, seek to inflict pain and damage to one's being, to one's physical body, to one's sensibilities, to one's soul. And they delight in that. They feed off of that. They delight in that. It's their joy in a sick, perverted, demented. They're psychopathic. Is about the closest you can speak it. And so these things exist. And it's not so trivial as to say, oh, that's just a wounded part of the deep psyche or something. That just doesn't make sense when you're experiencing. I'll just say it that way. Not that there isn't a truth in that, but that's not what this is. These are real experiences, and physically painful. Not to mention how morally injurious, the kind of moral injury and spiritual injury that these things cause. But I've had to deal with it, and I've had to figure out how to confront in some cases, transmute in some cases, defend, protect. And I will say, and I did a whole video on this called Spiritual Attack or something like that, the name of Jesus Christ has power. It just does. There's just some kind of universal recognition, even in these other realms, even to these other beings, that when you invoke in a sincere way, in a powerful way, the presence of Jesus Christ, you call in Jesus Christ, there is a protection, a transformation, a defense that happens, that it can repel. Now, I have to also be honest here, all the way through, it has not worked in every case, and I don't know what the difference is there. But to me, it's very significant that it has worked in some cases, so that speaks to me about the power of Christ in a very real way that matters to me. And the other part of all this supernatural interference that I've been having is major OCD, obsessive thoughts. And the most brutal aspect, and I've done a couple videos on this, are these etheric implants, these chains, cords, wires, objects, technology, all kinds of weird shit threaded throughout my subtle body. I know it's not a Christian way of putting it, but I'm just going to say it that way. You can say my spirit body. But they're physical. I experience them now, currently, around the clock, in waking reality, clear as day, not vague, not conceptual, not some idea that was planted in my head about something, not psychosomatic, not some archetype or they're not symbolic, no. Real, actual, physical pain. It's happening on a slightly subtler level. But the pain is not subtle, and they're crystal clear, threaded all throughout my body. And that's brought me to my knees. I've been dealing with it for the past 6 years, and it's bad. It's awful. So that's another reason why, I'm turning to Jesus and asking for his help, And I've done a few, I've met up with on Zoom, at least, this guy who does deliverance prayer and has a class, and had some people pray over me. I've made a friend, Christian friend. He's done prayer for me over the phone, deliverance. And that's another part of this reason why, I'm stepping out, stretching myself, trying, to go to church, trying to do these things, is if this is true peace. Everybody says, this is the Prince of Peace, this is the truth, this is the way. Well, I'm trying that, and I'm doing, as sincere of a job as I can, and saying prayers and asking Jesus into my life, and even doing all the traditional kind of evangelical affirmations, and I'm just trying whatever, People say this is the truth. I have to say, at this point, it has not brought the relief that I hoped it would. I feel I've done it in a sincere way, not perfectly. And maybe there's the one magic prayer that I haven't said. There was one time at church where they kind of did an altar call and I didn't stand up. I felt some kind of fear. And I kind of look back at was that my chance right then and there? But I didn't feel really comfortable with the church. That was one that was really kind of political, and I don't know. So, there's ways that perhaps I haven't done it perfectly, but I've done a lot over years, moving in that direction. And I would think that at some point I would notice at least some diminution, some release, some breaking of these. To me, that's kind of the litmus test, is if I'm still experiencing this. They say Jesus can heal anything, all things are possible, can break any chain. And I'm open to that, I'm a parched man in the desert, desperate for relief. So when you're on your knees, you become more open to trying different things. Anyways, I have to report that it has not transformed the situation. So that's also very confusing for me. I've given my life to Jesus. I've said that many times in a sincere way. Repudiated everything, That's part of what you do in deliverance prayer. Reject, repudiate, break ties with, all other forms of spirituality. You accept the exclusivity of Christianity. And I'm not somebody that's saying there needs to be a quick and easy fix. No, I've been in this hell for 6 years, and I don't expect there to be a quick and easy fix. It'd be great, and I think it's possible. I think anything's possible with God. But I'm not looking for a one session and done. I am, however, I think fairly anticipating that, you give your life into a certain direction. There's certain promises made that you would see some results, even if not full healing, just something to indicate, yes, my son, this is the direction, more fully into this direction. You've stepped out in big ways. You've stepped out of your comfort zone. You've earnestly engaged. You've taken more than one step. You take one step, God takes 1,000 towards you. You've more than asked, you've more than knocked, you've more than, ask and it shall be given, knock and it shall be open to you. You've more than done that, son. And so I'm going to come, with great force, or at least with a trickle, and say this is the right direction. I don't want to say there's been nothing, but certainly none of the healing that I need. So I just have to be honest about that too. So I keep praying. I haven't given up. What would giving up mean? I guess it would mean killing myself or something. And I shouldn't say something like that so boldly. I'm not suicidal. I don't want to kill myself. I'm just saying, what other option do I have? I need help. I need relief, and it's spiritual help that I need. And so, anyways, I think I'm going to go to church this Sunday. I want to go to an Episcopal church and try that out, I think. Continue to read my Bible, continue to pray, continue to call out to Jesus, continue to surrender, and hope to hear from God. Jesus Christ, come forth in my life. I surrender my life to you. reveal the truth to me, not in a dogmatic way, not in a conceptual way, but in a way that is unmistakable, the direction that you have for my life. Maybe so. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Take care.